Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Beyond the Crucible. I'm Gary Schneeberger, the co-host of the show and the communications director for Crucible Leadership. And you have clicked play on, we really hope you've clicked subscribe to, a podcast that deals in what we call at Crucible Leadership, crucible experiences. Now, that term may be unfamiliar to you, but the experience itself is probably not unfamiliar to you, because a crucible experience is one of those things that happens in life, and you can have more than one in your life as you go through your life. Those moments in life that are painful, traumatic, failures, setbacks, traumas, tragedies, those things that can happen to you that knock the wind out of your sails, that feel like they knock you off off your feet, that feel in many cases, and in many cases do, alter the trajectory of your life. But here's the good news. We don't talk about them like we're sitting around a campfire swapping war stories. We don't talk about them so we can wallow in them. We discuss them here to offer hope and healing. As Warwick has said, we are traffickers in hope. We talk about hopeful ways, hopeful tips, ways in which you can move beyond those crucibles to lead a better life that's on purpose and filled with far more joy than you could have imagined in the midst of those crucibles. And with me, as always, in this conversation is who I mentioned earlier there, Warwick Fairfax, who's the founder of Crucible Leadership. He is the chief architect of Beyond the Crucible, and he will be who you hear mostly from in our conversation with our guest today. Warwick, this is a good one, and we got turned on to this guest because you read an article in the Washington Post.
Absolutely. Great to be here. And yes, I saw an article by Marta in the Washington Post that dealt with purpose. I thought, boy, purpose, that sounds like a fascinating subject. So, yeah.
That is right up our alley. Well, the guest, Marta, who Warwick referred to, I will read her bio, and there's a moment, just a couple of lines into the bio, that is perhaps one of the most humble things any guest has ever written in a bio. And I'll point it out. You'll hear it when I say it, but I'll point it out to listeners so you can hear it. But Marta Zaraska is a Canadian science writer published in the Washington Post, Scientific American, The Atlantic, etc. How many of us who have those kinds of credits to our name, who have achieved that kind of professional success, would be like, oh, and etc. Then there's a few other ones. You'll hear that, I believe, in our conversation today. Her new book, Growing Young: How Friendship, Optimism, and Kindness Can Help You Live to 100, is a Globe and Mail bestseller. I'm going to hold it up here for anybody who's watching on YouTube. There's the book. It is a fascinating read. Growing Young was endorsed by Adam Grant, Dan Buettner, Emerin Mayer, along with others, and named by the Wall Street Journal as one of the best books of 2020 on longevity and aging. You may be asking yourself, how's a book on longevity and aging fit into the Crucible Leadership model of what we talk about here? Warwick, take it away and let people hear exactly how that fits, because it fits perfectly.
Absolutely, Gary. Well, Marta, thank you so much for being here. When I read, I think it was a couple of weeks or so ago, the article in the Washington Post that talked about purpose and how having purpose could help increase longevity, I thought, boy, it kind of makes sense intuitively, but I haven't really read an article and now a book that actually talks about that from a science perspective. So that's fascinating, because the Crucible Leadership, we're all about helping folks bounce back from their crucibles, setbacks, and failures to lead a life of significance, which we define as a life on purpose dedicated to serving others. So that's right in our wheelhouse, or what our listeners will be curious about. So, Marta, thank you again so much for being here. Before we get into the book, tell us a little bit about how you became a science writer and sort of the background, because I think you're Canadian, living in France, but I believe you were born in Poland. So tell us a little bit about that journey, about your background and how you came to be a science writer.
I mean, I've been a journalist for over 2 decades now, so it's been a while. I started as a foreign affairs journalist. I was working in Poland for several major publications there. I used to write about things like social issues in Africa. I traveled a lot as well to many places in Africa, especially. Then, as a very young adult, I moved out of Poland. I moved to Canada, and a few years later, I also became Canadian. But I started writing in English at some point as well, and decided that maybe traveling to Africa and very dangerous places generally wasn't going very well in line with starting a family. So I decided to switch to a different type of writing, science writing, although it's kind of connected to my previous work as well, because when I was writing about environmental issues in Africa or some social issues, water shortages, it was also very much based in science already. And I'm also married to a scientist, so it was kind of a natural change of course for me. But I've been doing it for many years as well right now. So writing, as you've mentioned before, for Scientific American, the Washington Post especially, and other publications. There is Los Angeles Times, there, etc. that you've mentioned. I'm sorry for all my editors in those newspapers for putting them there, but Discover, New Scientists, etc.
Wow, that's amazing. So now, did you meet your husband in Poland or Canada or?
Poland. I mean, we married crazily young, so yeah.
Okay. And speaking of that, you have 1 or 2 kids?
One daughter. Yeah, she's 8.
One daughter. Okay. So I'm sure it's fascinating to see as she grows up all of the different tendencies and changes. And so it's one thing to read about people in scientific journals and papers, but then you get to observe a person too. And that must be pretty interesting, I imagine.
I mean, definitely also, we are, as I said, we are both Polish-born, naturalized Canadians, and we live in France right now, so we're actually raising a French person, which is an additional twist to the whole parenting story.
So what led you to move to France, out of curiosity?
I mean, that was my husband's PhD, and we stayed afterwards.
Okay. So I imagine your daughter's probably obviously fluent in French, and I guess she probably knows a bit of English and Polish, does she?
I mean, she's trilingual, so she's absolutely fluent in both French and English with no difference. And her Polish is slightly worse than English and French, but she also can communicate fluently.
I'm sure with the grandparents and all that would be important. So
that is tremendously impressive. I am barely many days unilingual. So
yeah, that's awesome. So I want to get into the book a bit, but I think one of the challenges you mentioned was coming from Poland, writing for a Polish language journal. It wasn't the easiest thing in the world to get published in papers such as the Washington Post, and writing in another language is not the easiest thing, I'm sure, especially when you're writing scientific articles. I mean, I did a bit of French in school, and I can probably, order a meal or get a room for the night, but there's no way I could talk in French about some scientific subject. That would be way beyond me. So that must not have been easy, I imagine.
I mean, the funny part is I cannot write in Polish about science at all. So it's the interesting twist here. But it's extremely difficult for me. But switching to English was a challenge, a big one, definitely. And to do so, me and my husband at some point many years ago, we've actually decided to switch to speaking English at home. Which is something that many people find extremely weird, that we are both Polish and we speak English at home and our daughter speaks English with us at home. But from both our work's perspective, it was vital, because we knew we were staying in the West, and to be able to write properly in English, I had to think in English, and to think in English, I had to speak in English. So that's what we've decided to do. And yes, breaking into the Western market is certainly a challenge, and unfortunately, even the top credits from Poland are, not very much appreciated usually. So it was I got a lot of rejection letters before I managed to break into my first publication was Globe and Mail in Canada. And I really appreciate the chance that the editor there in the international section took on me. So yeah, that was extremely challenging, and it took a lot of being very, very stubborn and sending my emails and letters over and over and over and over again. I guess I'm pretty stubborn. And then once you write your first Washington Post article, then suddenly the doors open and things become much, much easier.
Well, the power of persistence, a very important quality. It's anybody that's succeeded. I can't think of anybody that hasn't been persistent. I don't know if persistence adds years to your life, but it should. So I'm trying to remember if I read that. I'm not sure. But so talk a bit about what led you to write Growing Young, because I know you've written another book, but why this book? I mean, was there anything that's linked to your background, family, any sort of reason why this whole Growing Young concept was fascinating to you?
I mean, it came quite naturally out of my writing because I write mostly about biological sciences, so everything concerning health, nutrition, psychology, and also longevity. So all these kind of topics, I've been covering them in my articles previously. So there weren't any surprising twists here. And also, as in my private life, I've been quite interested in longevity and health. And I think the book started basically, the idea for the book was at first to be a parenting book, actually. So I thought, as a mother, I had this kind of wish that my daughter would live healthy and long. And I was thinking, how can I help her achieve that? How can I assure that she'll live a healthy and long life? So I started gathering data and reading articles and journals and talking to experts, trying to figure out, what makes people live long. And of course, there was the diet and exercise, but at the same time, I started coming across more and more research showing that this social side of health, so whether we are socially integrated, whether we have purpose in life, meaning, whether we are optimistic, conscientious, all these kind of things matter at least as much for health and longevity as diet and exercise. And when I realized that, I realized also that there was something much bigger here than just a parenting book, because this applies to everyone, not just for making sure that my daughter live long and healthy, and for children in general, but also for us parents and the grandparents, for everybody, right? And this was a huge point that seemed to be missing completely from the discussions we were having in the media about what makes people live long and healthy. And this is why I decided to do even more research, and I ended up reading over 600 research papers to write this book. And this is how Growing Young came about.
It's interesting because, as you write in the book, it's easier to measure the effect of diet, exercise, nutrition, probably scientifically than the things you write about, committed relationships, purpose, the socialization with friends. I mean, it's probably a little, it feels a little more fuzzy. Maybe it's not as fuzzy, but that's the popular concept. I know there's a couple of things you write in your book, which again, I found absolutely fascinating, from everything from marriage to relationships to loneliness, so many things. You wrote a couple of things that talked about your purpose in the book. You write one comment that says, I wrote Growing Young out of a belief that in the deluge of reductionist wellness news, we've somehow lost the big picture, ignoring the things that matter the most for our longevity, relationships, emotions, and the psyche. And then sort of another one you write, my goal in writing this book was to help you fundamentally rethink how you approach your health. Whether you might be putting too much effort into strategies that don't work well, supplements, fitness trackers, and not enough into those that truly matter, your love life, your friendships, your life's meaning. So talk about, and obviously you're not saying that diet and exercise and health are not important. I mean, I'm sure you're reading your book, you and your husband and daughter take that all seriously. But talk about how there's almost a fascination and obsession, my words, not yours, with the latest diet, the latest fitness tracker, the latest treadmill machine. We're just so focused on measuring pounds and calories and body fat. but yet we don't really think too much of some of these other things, such as relationships, emotions, and the such. So talk about the obsession the world, certainly the Western world, has with that versus these other factors that seem to be pretty important.
I mean, we certainly are obsessed. When you think about it, half of all American adults take at least one dietary supplement every single day, and the sales of all this kind of fitness trackers are absolutely booming. And so I believe what's happening are two things. So for one, we find it comforting in a way that to measure things. We like to kind of simple solutions. So if you pop this kind of miracle supplement, your telomeres will become longer. If you measure your HRV rates, you will know exactly how old you are. If you take 10,000 steps exactly per day, then you'll be healthy. So we really like this kind of simple solution. This is what you do, and this is the results you're going to get. But I also think it's fueled by marketing and sales, basically, of all the companies that are selling us those products. Because, why do we keep hearing about miracle diets and supplements and exercise gadgets so much and so little about the impact of friendship and social inclusion, happiness, purpose on health, even though these things have been established in science for a very long time? And I believe the reason is exactly that when we are talking about diet and exercise, there are products that are being sold to us. All this supplements. This is a huge multi-billion-dollar industry worldwide. The fitness trackers, there is somebody making money on all those things. So they are being advertised, they are being publicized by by influencers on social media. So this is why we hear about all those things. Whereas when we are talking about purpose in life, it's hard to make money. Nobody's making money on you finding meaning in your life. So this is why you don't hear about it. You don't see it on Instagram, because it's just not making money for anybody.
Right. Can you imagine? Here's this magic pill. Have this pill for 3 weeks and you won't be lonely. Have this other pill and you'll have a happy marriage. It's like, it'd be tough to sell that one. But
unfortunately, it doesn't exist.
No, I mean, it's funny, we are in my family somewhat emblematic of what you're talking about. I mean, I'm very blessed. My wife cooks very well, and she goes to health food places like Whole Foods, huge U.S. place. So we eat organic stuff, and yes, I got to confess, we do have the odd supplement. I'll have to ask. I hope it doesn't have any lead in it, like some of the supplements you mentioned in your book. But yeah, I mean, though I like to think we're also focused on purpose too. But it is.
I have to jump in and say,
please go ahead.
I feel really bad that I said at the outset off air that I'm keeping track of time on my Fitbit, so I know how long we're going. So I'm just going to sit over here and not say anything and sort of shrink back.
Yeah, and perhaps not look at your Fitbit too much, right?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. So I mean, but what you say is there's so many interesting takes. I mean, I want to get to purpose here and Ikigai, which I'm sure I'll mispronounce a little bit, because that's purpose is so much of what we talk about here at Crucible Leadership. But there are so many interesting stats you have, and you've got a great chart in there that lists a whole bunch of diet things you can do and exercise, and then everything from relationships to having purpose and social networks. But there's one quote that I think you kind of have in there that really sums up everything and compares some key dietary and exercise components with more of the social aspects. So this whole paragraph I found fascinating. So here's what you wrote. You wrote, here are some stats. Eating 6 or more servings of fruits and vegetables a day versus 0 lowers the risk of mortality by 26%. Sticking to the famed Mediterranean diet means a 20 to 21% lower risk of dying within the next few years. The number for many social factors are much higher. A happy marriage equals a 49% lower mortality risk. Living with someone, just a roommate, as opposed to living alone, 90 to 32%. Having a large network of friends, 45%. Other mindset and social indicators have effects similar to that of a super healthy eating style. Volunteering lowers mortality risk by 22%, more or less as much as following the Mediterranean diet. if you were to add everything together, combining a good marriage, strong friendships, feelings of belonging, and so forth, to create a complex measure of social integration, or something that we call the essence of the Rosetta effect, which is some town in Pennsylvania in the early 60s where people were super close with each other, you would get a whopping 65% reduction in mortality. I mean, that's just staggering. Here's all of these things from Mediterranean, fruit and vegetables, but you compare that with things like, marriage, volunteering, social networks. It's not to say you shouldn't do that, but it has as big an effect. I mean, that was astounding to me, those statistics. I mean, it's mind-blowing.
I mean, there was also a disclaimer afterwards, and I think it's quite important to mention that, so that these numbers are coming from very different studies with very, very varying methodologies. So I don't want people to get hung up on the number. It's exactly 21%, and here is exactly 26%. Yeah. It's just about giving a rough idea about how important these things are. But it doesn't mean that you should be comparing them exactly, because I said they come from different studies. So, but in general, research shows that social integration is at least as important as diet and exercise, and perhaps even more important than diet and exercise, even though diet and exercise are, of course, very important for your health and longevity, but these things are maybe even more. So in the perfect scenario, you will be eating healthy and exercising and making sure you are socially integrated, that you were involved in your community, that you had purpose in life. But also when we talk about diet and exercise, once again, it's not this kind of obsessive type of diet and exercise when we are searching for all the best miracle foods and diets and eating manuka honey and sprinkled with, goji berries and popping all the possible telomere enhancing supplements. It's kind of simple. It's just, avoiding junk food and too much sugar, eating your fruits and veggies, which can be perfectly fine. Carrots and apples and pears are, there's nothing wrong with them. They are very healthy and good for you. So kind of simple, but still very important.
No, absolutely. And, I grew up in Australia, but live in the US now. My wife's American. We lived here about 30 years. There are some comparisons that I found fascinating. You talk about eating at the dinner table together. And in France, I think you mentioned people in 30s and 40s, 61% eat with their families at night. Compared to 24% of Americans. I mean, that's just makes so much sense. I mean, I'm sort of blessed. We have 3 kids in their 20s, and because of COVID, they're all living with us. And pretty much every night we do eat together. I mean, that's the way I grew up. In Australia, we always ate together. I mean, once in a while on the weekend, maybe we'll watch TV while eating, but that sense of just being together as you eat, maybe again, Australian culture is different than American. So when I was growing up, I can't ever remember eating food in the car. That was sort of anathema. It's just having moved here, and got married, I had to realize people do that, which I thought was somewhat barbaric, and I'm sure anybody in France would agree that eating in the car is barbaric. I don't know about Poland, but certainly the French would certainly believe it's but yeah, that sense of just, and often, we'll be talking around the dinner table, and time will be getting on. I'll kind of want to, wash the dishes and relax, and we're still talking. It's like, and I'm not that impatient. I like socializing, but it's not a 5-minute meal. I mean, it's an hour and a half. I mean, it's every night. So I guess we're unusual. But talk about, I mean, people don't do that much, certainly in America, and maybe Canada too. So there are certain cultural things that have just changed in the last 30, 40 years that are not for the good, don't you think?
I mean, certainly, I lived in Canada for several years, obviously, and I got used to eating in my car as well, and eating while walking down the street. And then I moved to France. And I suddenly discovered that it's a horrible faux pas to eat in your car or walking down the street. You just don't do that. People will be looking at you like you're a crazy person. So I would never do that right now. And one time I was somewhere away for work, and I actually had to eat a sandwich rushing from one meeting to another and walking down the street. And I felt so horrible doing it. I had the sandwich in my handbag, and I was like sneaking, like at school, like a kid in school, kind of eating during class. And it's true that, for the French, eating at a table is extremely important, like in all Mediterranean cultures. For instance, my daughter here in a French school, she has a 2-hour break for lunch, and for at least an hour, they sit at a table and eat. They have, an appetizer, then a second appetizer, then the main dish, then cheese platter, and then the dessert. So it's something extremely important for the culture here. And this is what I also write about in Growing Young, that, that we often focus so much on the Mediterranean diet in terms of what kind of nutrients it contains, how much olive oil people are taking in when they're eating a Mediterranean diet, how many grams of tomatoes, or, how much wine they are drinking, and calculating everything, in this reductionist way exactly. Whereas the extremely important part of the Mediterranean diet is actually how they eat. It's not only about what they eat, it's important, but it's not only that, it's also how they eat. And in Spain, in Italy, in France, in those Mediterranean cultures, you eat with other people. You eat slowly, you take your time, you talk, this is extremely important. So if you eat the same diet, the Mediterranean diet, in your car alone, it won't have the same beneficial effects for your health. So this is a huge part that we are missing in North America, I think.
Yeah, and you make a very good point. I mean, as a science writer, you obviously want to understand cause and effect accurately. And so in some of these with blue zones, Sardinia, which, island off of Italy, they study, boy, look how, people live long and they're healthy. Well, yes, and they do eat, I'm sure, fruit, vegetables, olive oil, salads, but they probably eat amongst friends. They have social clubs. They help their friends and neighbors. A lot of the things you talk about in this book, they do as part of their culture. And so how do you figure out what's the diet and what's some of the social factors? I mean, it's probably not the easiest thing in the world to isolate. But while it's hard to isolate, you can't discount, you can't say, oh, it's all the Mediterranean diet. I mean, that's a good point. But I mean, I've seen documentaries on, blue zones, and they talk about some of these other things, but it seems like the focus is on the diet, not on the other.
I mean, so for instance, a real life experiment was what happens in something you've mentioned earlier on, the Roseto. So Roseto is a town in Pennsylvania that was actually settled by immigrants from Italy. And when they came over to Pennsylvania, they actually abandoned their Mediterranean diet very, very fast, unfortunately, and started eating the typical American diet, very greasy diet with lots of sausages and meat, and they drank a lot of alcohol, a lot of beer, and so they were definitely not eating healthy. They were also smoking a lot. And at the same time, this Roseto became famous because nobody was dying of heart attacks there. This attracted attention of scientists and doctors back in the 1960s. It was really set apart from all the surrounding areas, even though they had the same healthcare, same water system, the similar social profiles, horrible diet once again, and yet people were living much longer. I think their mortality rates were like 30% lower, which is huge. And so the doctors started studying the people there. They discovered it's not their genes either. There was nothing in there. But what was special about this town was that people there brought this exactly Mediterranean culture with them. So they were extremely social. They were constantly visiting. Everybody knew all the neighbors. They were having huge backyard parties where everybody was invited. They were taking care of their front yards so the town would look pretty for everybody. They had 22 civic organizations in a town of 2,000 people, which is unbelievable. And so scientists concluded that this was what was making them healthy, and this was named the Roseto effect. And also what the scientists did, they predicted back then in the 1960s that were the Rosetans ever to abandon their ways and just follow the usual American dream, the effects would disappear. And this is unfortunately what has happened in the 80s and 90s, when the next generation started to move to the suburbs, work longer hours to be able to afford bigger houses, started driving in their bigger cars. And they stopped visiting, they stopped having these community relationships, they stopped taking part in the civic organizations. And unfortunately, by now, their health just is American average. This kind of protective effects and their amazing cardiovascular health has completely disappeared.
Yeah, I mean, that's very instructive. They were eating an unhealthy diet, but yet they were living longer. And once they abandoned that, tight-knit social lifestyle, their health changed. I mean, that would seem to be very determinative. Kind of one other thing before we get to purpose I found fascinating is you talk about committed romantic relationship, which obviously could be marriage, but you sort of differentiate that between cohabiting where there's not a lifelong commitment. However you frame, obviously marriage, in theory, it's clearer, but whether it's marriage or some alternative where you go in there thinking we're doing this for life, the fact that it lowers mortality by 49%, I mean, even with a roommate, I think I read somewhere it's maybe 20% or something. But I mean, that's just staggering, the effect of a committed, long-term relationship such as marriage. So talk about why that makes such a difference.
I mean, it's all about, it boils down to our sense of security in the most basic form. Because when you think about it, we are social apes. So we evolved to be with our tribe, and this is where we feel the safest, and this is where our bodies function the best. And our fight or flight response, so for instance, our HPA axis, so hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, this kind of stress response that you activate, for instance, activated back in evolutionary past when you stumbled upon a lion on the savannah, and today is activated by anything from your mortgage worries to traffic jams. This functions the best when we are with others. Basically, we feel safe when we are with other people. And when you are in a committed relationship like that, exactly, the committed part is important because you know that the other person will be there for you for better or for worse. And then all the stress responses can function better because there is some support. You are not alone. And so all the biological processes that turn on when we are when we are stressed, from different expression of genes related to our inflammation levels, to antiviral response, to cancer progression, all these kind of things function better when we feel safe. So this is part of it. The other part of it is also, for instance, that we exchange microbes with other people. So we know that we exchange microbes with our friends, with our family, but in particular with our romantic partners, because we touch, because we hit. And the more diverse people have their gut microbes, generally the better their health functions. So there are also other connections. There are social hormones that we have, like oxytocin, serotonin, for instance, that get released when we are touching, when we are talking, when we are looking deeply into each other's eyes, when we are getting all these warm feelings of trust and connection, but also that have very downstream, very biological effects on our body. So, for instance, oxytocin has anti-inflammatory effects, serotonin has effects on the liver, endorphins are natural painkillers. So you have all these hormones that are, at one hand, acting as kind of the social connection hormones, and on the other hand, have very direct biological effects on our body, including on our gut microbiome. Everything is connected, and talking, all this kind of two-way pathways between our brain and gut and all the hormones interacting the best and working the best when we are feeling safe, connected, and that we can trust people around us.
And the flip side of what you were talking about, and Warwick's question about how committed relationships, friendships, those kind of things help longevity. The chapter 5 in your book sort of deals with the negative side of that, right? The lack of that. That's called the gnawing parasite of loneliness. Explain a little bit about, we, especially in America, we can hear a lot about feeling lonely, and there's the connection, quote unquote, that comes from some of our electronic ability to interact with one another. But studies, I think, have shown that isn't really connection. What is the effect of loneliness on what you just described, right? The absence of all of those things. What does that do to us?
Yeah, so loneliness is the flip side of it. So you you have all the systems activated. So for instance, we know that people who are lonely, they have shorter telomeres, so those protective caps at your end of chromosomes that have take part in aging. They have different gene expression when it comes to cancer progression, more negative. They have more inflammation levels. They have worse antiviral response. They even respond worse to vaccinations. So there are lots of things that are happening when we are lonely. And this is already becoming more and more recognized by health authorities around the world. For instance, in the UK, they now have a Ministry for Loneliness because they know that this is costing the public healthcare system money, and a lot of money at that. There were even some calculations how much exactly there was, I don't remember the figures, but they were very high. Also in Manitoba, in Canada, there is a Ministry for Senior Loneliness. So it's becoming recognized that it's a really big problem for our health. And it is true that, the online connection doesn't give us the same things, which of course brings us to the pandemic. And a lot of people are asking me these days, are we doomed? Are we going to all live shorter because we are not connecting now? And is it really, really bad for our health? And whereas it's definitely not good for our health to be, separated and not being able to connect in our natural, normal ways with other people. On the other hand, when scientists study social inclusion and loneliness, the questions they usually ask people are there any people out there on whom you can count on? Is there anybody out there who would bring you soup if you were sick? Is there anybody out there whom you could call and talk about your problems? And the thing is that, even though we are now isolating, these things haven't disappeared. So if you had friends like that, they can still bring you the soup and drop it at your doorstep, right? Even if you cannot meet them in person, you can still pick up the phone and call them. So I don't think this is the same kind of loneliness that researchers are talking about in research papers, because they are talking about chronic loneliness, so that you really do not have people like that. There is nobody who would bring you, some medicines if you're sick. There is nobody who would drive you to the airport. There is nobody who you can call. And this is when it's problematic.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. One other thing that a lot of things I found fascinating. You talk about the power of meditation, different religious traditions, different philosophies, such as of yoga, and maybe as a way of controlling, regulating emotions, feelings. You mentioned an example of somebody that could have like a root canal, I think it was, and through meditation was able to sort of deal with the pain, which I find fascinating. And I'm person of faith, so I think of prayer, at least from my perspective, when I try and relate it to what you talk about, prayer and meditation. And it's just fascinating how in different religious traditions they tell you how to meditate or how to pray, and some of the ways that you do that actually make some degree of sense. It's like even the so-called, some people analyze in great detail the Lord's Prayer, which anybody in a Christian tradition, like it or not, have to recite. But when you analyze the different aspects of it from almost like a meditative perspective, there are things like focusing on not yourself, but some other higher power, something external. There's realizing maybe there's some higher power in control. There's focusing. Anybody that's serious about prayer will tell you, don't go to God with your laundry list. That is a quote unquote wrong way to pray. Focus on praying for other people. So as I read meditation, I could really, and some of these traditions, I could, translate it in terms of prayer. It was very similar conceptually. So talk about how, whether it's prayer, meditation, different religious traditions, how they help you regulate your psyche, and in some ways also add to longevity. What's the relationship between all of that?
I mean, so generally, thinking about exactly something outside of yourself. So this is what I write about in Growing Young, as looking outwards, right? Not only inside yourself, like, what I'm eating, what I'm ingesting, how many steps I'm taking, and just kind of looking how you can be helpful, how you can add something to the community, how you can be kind, how you can be better. And this is all, these are the parts when I write about kindness and empathy and volunteering, for instance. It has huge impact on health. generally caring for other people. Also, meaning and purpose. It's also about looking outside of yourself at a bigger picture, how you can be helpful. The last chapter of my book, I write about Japan, and I traveled there to talk to people, researchers, and also centenarians about longevity. And one extremely important part of longevity research and longevity conversation in Japan is Ikigai. So this purpose in life, meaning in life, reason for living. And it's so important for them that even their Ministry of Health, actually, when they are talking about paths to health and longevity, they actually talk about Ikigai as much as they talk about diet and exercise. So it's really recognized as really boosting health. And there is plenty of research showing it lowers your risk, for example, for cardiovascular problems and other health problems in general. And Ikigai, it's exactly about contributing something to others. Sometimes I ask in interviews in the West, for instance, can golfing be my Ikigai? And generally, yes, I've been asked that question. So in general, the answer is unfortunately no. It has to be something outside of yourself, no matter how small. So, for instance, the Japanese people I've talked with, they told me that their Ikigai is taking care of their grandchildren or making sure their front yard looks pretty so the neighbors can enjoy it. This is also why many Japanese people take on something they call silver hair jobs. This is when they are already post-retirement age, but they decide to take on very simple, easy jobs, usually part-time, not to make money, but to be still involved in something, to be giving back to the community. So they can be public space gardeners, they can be helping children cross on the way to school, they can be doing things like that. And they usually say they do it because of Ikigai. So they feel needed, they feel involved, they feel they're giving back. And this is exactly what's so powerful in both kindness and finding meaning when it comes to longevity and health.
I think it's fascinating what you're saying, Marta, because in Ikigai, the focus is obviously outward focused. It's caring for their neighbors, their grandkids. It's not some internally focused purpose. And I mean, that's when we talk about in Crucible Leadership, a life of significance, which we view as the goal more than success. Not that success is wrong. You write about this a bit. I'm sure I read it there somewhere, that from our perspective, significance is a lifelong purpose dedicated to serving others. Now, what that could be very different things. Depends on, your values, your perspective, what's on your heart. But the fact that it seems like an Ikigai, and you visited a number of different places, one Matsukawa in Nagano province, which I guess is where they had the 98 Winter Olympics, which seemed to be like, one of the hubs of this. I think you write that men live longest in the whole of Japan, 82.2 years, 10 years longer than some folks in the U.S. So as you visited these towns, I mean, talk about what you saw. That it was focused on others, right? It was not I'm not against self-actualization, but it's like it was other focused. That was really the key to Ikigai, right? It wasn't just making my dreams, my this. It was more the community.
Generally definitely among the older population, because there's another thing, the Japan is changing very fast, right? So This is also what researchers are very much worried about, that even though they are now the longest living nation on the planet, this is because of culture and values that they've had in previous generations. But whether in 40, 50 years, Japan still will be such a long-lived nation is another question, because the young people, this is changing very much. So they are much more consumption-oriented. They are much more following Western values. And so this is kind of disappearing. But definitely when you look at the older people, they do have those beliefs. They really do look outwards. They really care about their community, how their village or town square looks like, about helping others. They exactly do those silver hair jobs. It's actually very, very common in Japan. This is not some kind of exception for crazy people. This is actually mainstream. So certainly these kind of values did make them such a long-lived nation. But if they change, then this will no longer continue.
And I almost feel like even in the West, some of these things begin to creep in. Somebody wrote a book a number of years ago, half-time, which is sort of the first half of your life, maybe you sort of are successful, and then second half is for significance. I think all of life should be significance, but that's another discussion. But I think more and more, even younger people, they want purpose and meaning. It's like if there are two jobs, one pays slightly better, 10% better, but you just feel like a small cog in a machine, you don't feel like you're treated well, and there's no purpose or meaning, you probably won't want it. More and more companies are trying to say, like, in America, I can think of some examples like Southwest Airlines, the most successful, probably best run airline. Their whole mission was to make travel affordable to connect families. That was their reason for being. So if you join that, it's like, well, that's a purpose in life outside of yourself that you can believe in. Who wouldn't want to make, especially 20 years ago when airline travel is not cheap, but it was much more expensive in days gone by. Who wouldn't want to help families get together through affordable travel? So some of the smart companies, at least I observe, are drifting towards, because their employees want it. Younger people want purpose and meaning. So do you see, I don't know if there's any data on this, but do you see some of that even in the West, that, there's maybe it's not because of living longer, but there's a desire for meaning and purpose in life, and that might be a lot of different things. It's not organized religion or anything, but there is this sense that people yearn for purpose. There's almost a growth in that desire. Do you see that at all in the West?
I mean, I've heard about it. I haven't seen hard data on intergenerational differences. I've definitely seen data on how the pandemic has changed our search for meaning for the better. In general, when times are tough, humans start to look for purpose and meaning. And there are several surveys right now showing that many people in the pandemic are looking more for purpose and meaning than they were before. And I think this is a very good change, both from our society's perspective, our mental health perspective, and also from our health and longevity perspective. So it's certainly good news that it's kind of shifting our focus and making us look at those things a little bit more.
One thing please go ahead, Gary.
And because this is a perfect time to inject this bit of information, Marta, that you said in your article in the Washington Post that got Warwick excited to have you on the show. You indicated that according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 4 out of 10 Americans haven't yet managed to find purpose in their lives. And I did, just before we hopped on this call, I did a quick survey of 4 in 10 Americans on Google just to see what else 4 in 10 Americans have done. And here's the interesting thing. I'm not a big statistics guy. I'm a word guy, not a number guy. But it seems like 4 in 10 tends to be the figure that's used for things that aren't good, right? So 4 in 10 Americans, for instance, have no idea how credit scores work. Okay. 4 in 10 Americans are now obese. That's germane to this conversation. 4 in 10 Americans from a study in 2015 breathe polluted air. And then my favorite one, which is not good, is 4 in 10 Americans said that they would rather give up their dog than give up their phone.
Oh my goodness.
So
that's bad. That's
terrible. and it goes exactly against what we've been talking about. So I bring that to you to say, yes, if people are anecdotally, you're hearing people are moving toward more of that. Why is it so hard still that 40% are still having a hard time finding that purpose? And what, based on your research, maybe is a tip or two you could give them to help get them in the right direction to find what we would call a life of significance?
I mean, it's just spending time on it. I think people just don't put it on their schedule to just sit down without looking at their phones and just think about what's my purpose and meaning. And, it can I believe anybody can find it. It can be found everywhere. Like there was this one fascinating study I've read about hospital workers, and it was actually about the cleaning staff of hospitals. And some of them considered their jobs absolutely horrible. They were like, oh, it's horrible. I'm cleaning toilets. It sucks. It's a bad job. I don't like it, and so on. But there was also a small part of those hospital workers who actually said that they love their jobs because they give them amazing sense of meaning. And the reason for that was that they had a different perspective on what they were doing. So they didn't consider themselves as just people who clean toilets. They considered themselves as people who are helping the patients get better, and the doctors and nurses to work better, and generally to help the hospital function and bring people back to health. They thought that cleaning the floors, this was keeping the germs away. Cleaning toilets was making it more pleasant for the patients. So just by shifting the focus, they made exactly the same job suddenly really good and giving them purpose and meaning. So I really believe that most people, can find in their jobs and what they are doing some kind of sense of meaning, but you have to really try. You have to spend some time to think about those things. What could it be? Can it be your family or maybe your community involvement or anything? Even when we are talking about kindness, which is related to purpose and meaning. In the research, research shows that acts of kindness can lower our levels of our stress hormone cortisol and generally, change our gene expression. But the kind acts they are talking about are usually quite small. It doesn't require, some kind of huge donating $1 million to charity. You can, for instance, just, open doors for someone to let them ahead of you. You can let people ahead of you in traffic. You can pick up trash in your neighborhood. It's just really small things. And yet they make all the difference. And I think it's the same thing with purpose. Of course, it's great if your purpose in life is to save, the world from climate change. Awesome. But, it can also be something small, very small steps. And it's all about shifting your perspective and just thinking about those things in the first place.
One other related thing on purpose I find fascinating, I think you brought in your article and in the book, is when, as we say, you go through crucible experiences, sometimes there can be greater meaning and purpose. You write about World War II, that there was a greater sense of purpose, I think, in France than almost at any other time since or something. There's a sense of, we're fighting against the Nazi Germany and the resistance and all of the many acts of heroism. I think in your article, you talk about Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, that hypothesized that higher purpose gives people a will to stay alive amidst, horrific experiences. Talk about how sometimes, nobody wants to go through crucible experiences, but sometimes our purpose in life or purpose can come amidst very challenging circumstances.
So I had this other article in the Washington Post. It was about the post-traumatic growth. And this is a phenomenon recognized in psychology. There's something that sometimes comes after post-traumatic stress disorder, which of course is a very bad thing to happen to you when you have this kind of traumatic experience. But for a certain percentage of people, the research is still uncertain for how many, depends on various factors, they can actually experience growth. So they consider themselves as stronger and more connected to other people and generally better off than they would otherwise have been if this traumatic event has not happened to them. Which is absolutely fascinating. And this research has been done, on war prisoners, on victims of hurricanes, on earthquakes, and really people who went through traumatic experiences. And yet, if they manage to talk, especially if they manage to talk through it with other people, if they manage to find exactly purpose and meaning perhaps in the experience, they can emerge even stronger than they would otherwise have otherwise been. Which for me, it really gives me hope, and that's nothing. Even if something really, really bad happens, there can be still something positive, perhaps coming out of it. And especially now that we are living this pandemic, and we know from previous studies on the first SARS epidemic that a lot of healthcare workers and people who were hospitalized, they experienced PTSD. But there are also emerging studies showing that there were also people experiencing this post-traumatic growth after the SARS pandemic. So there are potentially some silver linings here.
Yeah, as we kind of sum up, what fascinated me about your book and the article was just, we talk a lot now, to our listeners about how you bounce back from crucibles. It could be your fault or not your fault, failures, setbacks. And, as Gary always says at the end of the podcast, crucibles don't have to be the end of your story. They can be the beginning of an exciting new chapter. And what I like about what you write in your book is you provide really a roadmap in a sense. I mean, it's not necessarily your purpose, but you write a roadmap of how to recover from crucible experiences just by following the data, by obviously finding purpose. And as you find purpose, you want to do it in community because you're going to need support. You don't want to be alone. Thinking of others, kindness, empathy, meditation, prayer, different ways to get internally centered. These are all things to get beyond crucibles and live a fulfilling, satisfying life. I mean, pretty much every chapter has an aspect, committed relationships, that really help you live not just a long life, but a contented, joyful life if you follow these things, which again may not have been your purpose, but it does provide a roadmap for getting beyond crucibles and leading a joy-filled life. I mean, probably partly was your purpose too, but does that make some kind of sense,
I mean, totally. This is why I also called the book Growing Young. It was not about becoming younger in a way that, you get less wrinkles. It was about growing as a person, right? So you grow as a person. And if you grow as a person, you also stay young, or younger, you stay in better health, right? So that was this extremely important aspect for me. And that I also find extremely rewarding in a way that, if we improve, if we become better, if we become kinder, more socially connected, find meaning, give back to the community, become more optimistic, that we can actually also improve our health, both mental and physical.
Now, that sound that you heard, listener, was the captain turning on the fasten seatbelt sign, and we're coming to the place where we need to land the plane. As that happens, I'm duty bound to tell you, do not turn your phones on. Not only because the flight attendants say not to, but because, as Marta's been talking about, spending too much time in your phones can be bad for your sense of purpose, for your longevity. Marta, I would be remiss if I did not give you the opportunity, as we begin to wrap up here, to let listeners know how they can find out more about your book and find out more about you.
I mean, so you can find it in all the usual book selling places, from Amazon to all the small booksellers. And you can also find it on my website, which is www.growingyoungthebook.com. And you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at mzaraska, so MZARASKA.
Excellent. Warwick, do you have a final thought, a final question before we wrap?
Yeah, I mean, Marta, again, thanks so much for being here. Just, when I first read that article about purpose can help you live a longer life, and then read the book, it just everything resonated. Having purpose defined as thinking of others. It could be a big purpose, climate change, as you put it, but it could be just helping your neighborhood, like the folks in Japan, just cleaning the sidewalks outside their house, not just so much just for them, but just to make the whole street look better. I'm thinking of, you go to these Swiss villages, and my gosh, every little house has some geraniums or flowers outside. I mean, every single one is just staggering. And, the sidewalks also look spotless. So I don't know, maybe they have a similar concept, but just the sense of caring for others, of optimism, committed relationships, community, internal centering mechanisms, whether it's meditation or prayer, they will help you live longer, have more purpose, and have more joy. So the fact that there's some data behind doing things that seem to me to be common sense, and that actually says you will live longer and live healthier. I just found it very affirming and very encouraging. And I hope people will really pay attention to what you've said in your book, and not ditch diet and exercise, but you're not talking about that. It's just do what you need to do to be healthy, but don't overly obsess about the latest supplement or the latest fad, and don't ignore the social side, the purpose side. You can do both. You do both, you might actually be healthier, more joyful in all ways. I think your book has such an important message. It's really a clarion call for people to, don't ignore the social side. So it's really, it's very affirming, very challenging.
Thank you.
Well, listener, that sound you heard was the landing gear landing on the tarmac. And we have wrapped this episode of Beyond the Crucible. Here again, for those of you on YouTube, is Growing Young, Marta Zaraska's book. If you're not on YouTube, you just heard me say Growing Young is Marta Zaraska's book. So please get it. It's a fascinating read. It is it's one of those that the people in your household get sort of upset with you with, because you open it up and you can't put it down, and they're like, "Come to dinner. Wait a minute, I have to read more. There's still more to come." So, but one of the things that it points out, before I summarize some takeaways here, one of the things I think it points out, if I had to summarize it, and I wrote this on my notes, is that doing the things in this book, finding your purpose and applying your purpose and living your purpose, make the world a better place and let you enjoy it longer. And those are two great things to put together. You're improving your environment, you're improving your world, and you're improving your life in terms of you can live longer. And to that end, listener, here are some takeaways. And I'm going to, for the takeaways, I've got 4, and I'm going to use the statistics, and I'm going to preface some of these statistics with Marta's explanation that these are not, set in cement. These are from different studies with different, methodologies. And so don't take the statistics so much to heart as you would the arrow that they point toward, that these are good statistics. They're not, walking around quoting them verbatim, may not, because they're not all universal. But there's 4 key statistics, I think, that sum up this conversation that we've had with Marta Zaraska. One is volunteering can lower your risk of death by 17%. Set 17% aside. Volunteering can lower your risk of death. Doing something to help others can lower your mortality risk. 2, volunteering also lowers your risk for death. We're going to cut that, because volunteering doesn't lower risk of death by 17%. Something else does. When it was 17%, my apologies. I'm just going to start with, all right, if you don't mind, let's pick up. I'll insert this in there. So I have, from this book, I have pulled 3 tips. One is volunteering lowers your risk of death by 22%. That is a fascinating statistic. And again, don't get hung up on the number, get hung up on the arrow. Volunteering can make your life longer and better. And the benefit of that, if you volunteer to help someone who's lonely, that helps their life as well. The second thing is improving close relationships has a 45%. Again, don't get hung up on the number. It has a great impact on your longevity by improving close relationships. Having those people that Marta described who will call you up when you're sick and bring you soup or bring you medicine. Those kind of people, even in the situation we're in now with the pandemic, you can still have close relationships and you can still work on those things. And then the one that I ended our conversation with, the statistic is a bit stark, but it's not. It's one of those statistics we can change. 40% in the U.S. haven't found their purpose yet. Here's the good news about that. We can change it. You can put down your phone. You can unplug your video game. You can watch this if you're on YouTube. If you're not, I'm going to describe for you what I'm doing. I am taking off my fitness tracker. You can take off your fitness tracker and not be obsessed about it. If you do those things, then you think about it and take, as Warwick often has said, when you think about your purpose, you think about your purpose and you can take, as Warwick often says, one small step toward it. What that small step is going to vary for everybody listening to this conversation, but that's how you find your purpose. Think about it and then act on it. Take one small step to find out what that might be that aligns with your values and your talents, and then go pursue it. So, listener, until the next time that we're together here on Beyond the Crucible, thank you for spending time with us in this truly enlightening conversation with Marta Zaraska. If you would do a favor for Warwick and I, click subscribe to the podcast app on which you're listening to this show right now. That helps us reach more people with these kinds of conversations, which are eye-opening and hopefully experience opening for you as it leads you down the road to pursue that life of purpose. And until we are together the next time, remember this, that your crucible experience is painful and it's real, and we know that. We've been through those things. But it does not have to be the end of your story. In fact, it will not be the end of your story if you learn the lessons of that crucible, if you apply the lessons of that crucible to your life as you move forward. The reason it's not the end of your story, the reason it's the beginning of a new chapter in your story, and the most rewarding chapter of your story, is that new chapter, that new experience, those lessons you've learned applied to your life as you go forward, can lead you to a life of significance.